This is Reynolds Podcast, The Creative Mindset.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Creative Mindset, a podcast about what the future holds at the intersection of creativity and technology. I'm Ray Namoto, the founding partner of IANCO, a global innovation firm based in New York and Tokyo. Continuing from the last episode, today's guest is Tim Allen, the head of design and research at Instacart. If you haven't listened to part one of this conversation, where we talked about how Tim built a career in tech as a designer, please do go back and listen. I recently had him come to the course that I teach at Cornell University in New York City and asked him to give a lecture. In it, he shared his experience working at Airbnb. He started working there in 2020, a few months before the pandemic. So that was a really challenging time for the company for obvious reasons. One of the first things that he had to do was to lay off a big portion of his staff. In addition, he was specifically asked by Brian Chesky, the CEO and the founder of Airbnb, to work with him directly and a small select group of people to design a way out of this mess, quote unquote. So in part two, I asked Tim about how he was able to play a pivotal role at Airbnb, working with Brian Chesky in getting the company out of the pandemic. So let's get started.
You were at Airbnb during the height of the pandemic. And Airbnb is a business that relied on real world travels and people staying at other people's places. So it was very COVID unfriendly. Your boss, Brian Chesky, and a select group of people, including yourself, thought about and identify, hey, here's an opportunity or here's what we should do, and drastically improved. Yeah. So perhaps can you talk about that particular turnaround that Airbnb had? And then eventually, shortly after that, the company going public as well.
Yeah, that's definitely been the biggest career adventure I've been on. You go from March of 2020?
Yeah.
Staring into the abyss of bankruptcy, really, being a accommodations platform in a period where people were restricted to their homes is not the best place to be.
Yeah.
But what was shocking about that was everybody was betting against Airbnb, Wired magazine to any sort of editorial outlet for the industry. And there was this calm confidence that Brian Chesky had and he would just keep saying that this is a design problem and he was going to approach it like a design problem. That was astonishing at the time, still is. And he just focused on understanding what people's needs were what they were at the time and where he was projecting they would be. And it was an extreme show of compassion. Because you think about the hosts have these properties, they're in need of assistance, right? How can you help them? You have people that are trapped at home, right? How can you help them as well? One way to do that is to offer inventory for first responders. And so we did that in a creative way. And that was the start of climbing out of that abyss. Another thing we did was starting to understand that people probably wanted to stay in rural areas, not urban areas. That's obvious, right? But also stay for longer periods of time. So he was projected and predicted that as well. That was another facet of this reinvention. Another facet was building on the Airbnb experience platform we created just recently before the pandemic and creating online experiences that had just as much of that notion of belonging anywhere, or you could be in Colorado and be learning pasta making from a nonna in Italy or so forth, making that magic happen. That was another sort of facet of it. Anyway, there was 4 themes that came out of this sort of design sprint that you referenced. It was a small group of people working on. And that was the blueprint for the whole company. Brian being a designer, understanding the power of design, coming up with a human-centered sort of thematic approach very quickly and fairly calmly in the midst of all this chaos. And then us implementing it, because he also not only was a designer, but is lead of the company as well. And having the intuition and the confidence to implement all those things was pretty fascinating. And then 7-8 months later, go public, being extremely successful.
Yeah.
That was amazing.
Yeah. And then, so not just for the guests, but also for the host, how to onboard those guests in the first place.
Yeah. We reinvented a large part of the onboarding process to make hosting and just quicker as well. Prior to us redesigning that host onboarding experience during the pandemic, going from zero to a host took multiple days, and the new priority was basically 0 to host in 10 minutes.
10 minutes, wow, okay.
Yeah. So that was basically the design challenge, and we stepped up to the challenge, and we can go into details, but ultimately now the onboarding experience is drastically different than it used to be. It used to be basically a glorified form that you would fill out. And maybe if you wanted to read a bunch of documentation, you would understand and gain some confidence on what it would be like to be a host and how to create a listing that people would enjoy. But the new process was not only faster, it was media, videos, it welcomed you in a different way. It was just viscerally better. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that helped out too, just in terms of creating more hosts, because at a certain point, we needed more inventory in different places, mainly those rural communities I was talking about too. The problem became, how do you onboard those new hosts?
Yeah, understanding what the friction or what the desire might be, and then really empathizing with that need, and then turning that into action, and then connecting that back to the user. And then that then deepens the understanding of the user even more. And it's interesting that it's not just one big thing that you did, but it's actually a collection of different things. So that one thing you went through the cycle, understood better, and then there was another thing that you implemented and so forth. So that's the flywheel.
Yeah, exactly. It's basically this flywheel that goes from understanding people and context to compassion, which is one step further than empathy. I think the more you understand people and their needs, the more you're compelled to act. So compassion is not only putting yourself in someone else's shoes, but it's also being compelled to act because you've done that. And then compassion leading to the actual action itself of executing or implementing a solution, and then feeds back into understanding, because obviously once you've created a solution or a proposed solution, you can understand even more. And to a certain extent, that's just design in general. But I think the compassion, the point of compassion and the point of that compassion leading into action is the nuance. I think that requires a certain additional level of, I don't know if it's humility or curiosity, and maybe even a dab of courage to get to that point of true compassion. As with any design exercise, the farther you get into that flywheel, the more understanding you get, the more insight you receive, and the better the outcome is. All that work led to what is now the Airbnb home state of the categories, and this more flexible way of approaching merchandising and browsing accommodations and potential homes. Yeah, it used to be more like spearfishing, where people would come, you already know where you want to go, and usually it's the approximate time frame, and it's very get to point A to point B as quickly as possible. Yeah. And now it's about discovery, right? I just want to explore great pools, or I want to explore. I think they just released icons, which as a new category of homes that were featured in films and so forth. It was fascinating how understanding people, which is the core of design.
That's right. Yeah.
Led to so many different innovations during that time of panic and also like just now. So I love that.
Yeah, yeah. You were talking about some of the challenges that you've had, digging a little bit deep into a more recent, and it could be as recent as in the last couple of months, or it could be the last couple of years or so, but what are some professional challenges that you faced and how have you overcome them?
And the most recent one and challenge has been Instacart. Instacart is fascinating brand and company because there's four sides of the market. You have the consumer application, which a lot of people use to get their groceries delivered. You have the gig worker side of 600,000 shoppers. They have their own product ecosystem as well so that they can fulfill those orders. You have the retailer platform for like actual grocers and retailers that we use to digitally enable the actual retail locations themselves. And then you have an ad platform for consumer packaged goods companies to allow them to advertise on the platform too. And that's a whole ecosystem of tools as well. Super complicated and they're all interconnected and so forth. And to approach that rightfully, you have to it's a very technically complex problem to solve. And so a lot of times the approach to solving problems is very technical and complex. And so coming into this organization, there was this need and desire to infuse creativity into that very technical approach, which fascinated me too. Again, this theme of like utility and function with emotion and creativity. And so getting to your question of the challenge was culturally, how do you approach an organization that is used to approaching problems from a more analytical metric and experimentation side into a more sort of intuitively led, viscerally emotional and creative approach, or at least combining those two ways to approach things. That's been the biggest challenge for me. At first, a lot of my peers, and they'll say this now, like when I arrived, I was saying things, they were like, why is this person speaking about design and poetry and emotion and so forth and this mission we have of nourishment and food when we have to shave off milliseconds of shoppers fulfilling? It was very foreign to a lot of people. And now it's very interesting. Yeah, it's caught on, which is great.
Right.
Yeah, we're thinking much more creatively. Yeah. And that's not just because of me. It's just a different way to approach the problem set. And it's been fascinating to see what was very challenging at first.
Yeah.
Catch a lot of momentum. We're using that combination of creativity and like functional understanding in the way we hire people as well, which is fairly new. This notion of craft and quality and pride in what we make has grown as well. So yeah, it was a huge challenge at first, which is why I signed up for it, coming from Airbnb, where all that was set to a place that needed more of that. Right. Was like a big challenge.
Yeah. Airbnb, perhaps because of the founder who's got a design background, he understood what it means to be a right brain individual or right brain organization, whereas Instacart sounds a lot more analytical, or at least was a lot more analytical, coming from the left side of the brain, so to speak.
Yes, exactly.
That kind of process never ends at a certain point. But other than you talking about those things in meetings, what was some specific things that you did to shift the cultural mindset of an organization?
One was just not to be timid about disruptive thinking. I think a couple of months into my tenure at Instacart, just commissioned a design sprint based on what should this product feel like and what could it feel like without any boundaries. Like, what's a vision? What's a destination for this product? And got some very talented people to work on it together. And we created something that was pretty compelling and inspiring fairly quickly. And it was met with mixed emotions. Some people were super inspired by it. Some people were offended by it that we did for various reasons. Some people I think were outright scared by it. Like, how could we even do that? It was very disruptive, but I think that going through that and mitigating some of the things like rough edges of that really helped open up people's eyes to what was possible. If we really thought about this mission of delivering nourishment and food to communities and giving people access in like the most efficient, simple, and delightful way possible. It's different from the problem of how do you make grocery delivery profitable, which is an extremely difficult problem. And it's taken like a decade for us to chip away at and to create a solid business. That the way to think about that problem is very different than what people were confronted with this new design sprint, was like a very different approach. So anyway, yeah, it was disruptive and also effective.
So that was part 2 of my conversation with Tim Allen, the current head of design and research at Instacart and the former head of design at Airbnb, discussing how he, along with Brian Chesky, designed their way out of the pandemic. And not only did they manage to do so, but also make the company go public. The 3 key takeaways from part 2 of my conversation with Tim were: number 1, design can be a lifeline for a company's future. Number 2, embrace the flywheel of product design. And number 3, time is something you make, not something you get. So key takeaway number 1, design can be a lifeline for a company's future. When I asked him about how he and Brian Chesky and the select group of people at Airbnb designed their way out of the pandemic, he was very specific in telling me about the little improvements that they did sequentially that end up becoming and producing a bigger result for the company. So there were 4 specific things that they designed that eventually help the company get out of the pandemic. The first thing that they did was to offer discount stays for medical professionals. So if you remember, during the pandemic, obviously, there were a lot of medical professionals who had to work long hours to help the patients. So what Airbnb did in response to that was to offer discount stays for those medical professionals who had to be away from their own homes to serve the community. The second thing that they noticed was that stays in rural areas outside of big cities were increasing because, for obvious reasons, people were getting out of these big cities and trying to stay in suburbs and countryside. So that was another thing that they noticed and quickly tweaked the platform. People can book stays in rural areas more easily. That then led to them helping people book longer stays. So again, during the pandemic, it wasn't just a 2-day trip or 3-day trip that people were taking, but a week, 2 weeks, if not month and multiple months at a time that people were using Airbnb to get out of places like New York City where there was such a surge in the cases of the pandemic. A new behavior that they didn't quite see on Airbnb, but quickly redesigned certain elements of the process so that booking stays in rural areas, booking longer stays became easier. And finally, another thing that they did was the overhaul of the onboarding process for new hosts. They realized that more and more people were hosting places for guests to come to. But at the time, it took anywhere from a week to 10 days or more for these new hosts to sign up for Airbnb so that they can become official hosts. Instead, they took a hard look at that process and they shrunk the onboarding process from a week to 10 days to literally 15 minutes. Prior to taking a hard look at certain aspects of the platform, that part, the onboarding for hosts, is something that was functional, and many hosts were successful in becoming hosts, but the brilliance of using design to reassess an aspect and then make a major change relatively quickly, but drastic enough that it cut the process from 10 days to 15 minutes. And that's something that if you didn't look beneath the surface, it was part of the site that was working fine, but it took a much harder look at that situation, and it took the pandemic for them to realize and to redesign that particular aspect, which seems like a small portion of the site, and it might be, but making that process drastically easier for the hosts who are really the foundation of Airbnb's business. That was such a pivotal change that they made to the company. And that eventually helped Airbnb go public in the least likely time that they could have gone public. So that leads to my second key takeaway: embrace the flywheel of product design. So this concept, the flywheel of product design, is a Tim Allen original, as he put it. It's something that he had been thinking about for many, many years. And if you picture a diagram, and it's something that we talked about during the conversation with Tim, a picture a diagram, it's a circle. You have understanding at top. You have compassion to your right. You have assistance to the bottom, and you have connection. And repeating that cycle of understanding, compassion, assistance, and connection, that's what he calls the flywheel of product design. So once you find something by understanding the situation, the context, the user, the behavior, and then empathizing with compassion, and then finding a way to assist that realization, and then creating that connection, that circular process then leads back to understanding something else, being compassionate about the challenge, the situation that the user might be in, and then providing solution, and then connecting that to the back to the user, is, in his eye, what he calls the flywheel of product design, is an endless cycle of the process of this product design and innovation. And it's such a simple and elegant concept that I think many people talk about in different ways, but this was the first time that I heard this term, the flywheel, applied to product design, and he made it understandable for everybody else to see this process in this circular motion, so that it's a never-ending process. So if you take this concept, the flywheel of product design, and if you look back at the point that I made in key takeaway number 1, design can be a lifeline for a company's future, and 4 specific changes that they made, it was one thing leading to the next thing and the next thing and next thing. So it's the flywheel of product design in action that Tim, Brian Chesky, and the select team were able to do to make the company get out of the pandemic, or design their way out of the pandemic mess. And finally, key takeaway number 3, and this is more of a personal anecdote, which is time is something you make, not something you get. He talked about the fact that he is a morning person. He wakes up at 5 o'clock when everybody's asleep. And an hour or two before he gets busy with his family, his kids, he said that jokingly, but seriously, he said that he's a chief drop-off officer. He's got 2 young kids, and he takes them to the kindergarten and elementary school. And I can sympathize with that, because I'm also the chief drop-off officer of my family, or my household. But I don't wake up at 5 o'clock. I'm not a morning person, but he is a morning person. But he makes a point of making his own time to be able to do the thinking, the deep work that he can concentrate before anybody else in the household wakes up. and before he is getting bombarded with email and Slack messages. And this idea of time is something that you make, not something that you get. A lot of people complain, including myself, that, hey, I don't have the time to do this or I don't have time to do that. But it's really up to you to make that time to do something that you aren't able to. And it takes that kind of discipline. It takes that kind of mentality to be able to make time so that you have a moment of silence or moment of focus that you can do deep work. To summarize, the 3 key takeaways from my conversation with Tim are: number 1, design can be a lifeline for a company's future. Number 2, embrace the Flywheel product design. And number 3, time is something that you make, not something you get. If you like our podcast, please follow us wherever you're listening. And if you could leave us a 5-star rating, we'd be so grateful. If you have any questions or comments, please send them via the link in the show notes. I'm Reinventing, and this is the Creative Mindset. See you next time.